We acknowledge the original inhabitants of this area, the Coast Salish people. Since time immemorial, they have hunted, fished, gathered, and taken care of these lands. We respect their sovereignty, their right to self-determination, and honor their sacred spiritual connection with the land and the water. We will strive to be honest about our past mistakes and bring about a future that includes their people, stories, and voices to form a more just and equitable society. We welcome those of you online as well as those of you here at Our Saviors to the last session of our course, Indigenous Americans in Search of Truth and Reconciliation. Today, we are pleased to welcome two special guests, and I'll introduce them now. The Reverend Marlene White Rabbit Helgemo, an ordained Lutheran pastor serving All Nations Indian Church of the United Church of Christ in urban Minneapolis. She also serves as executive director of the Council of American Indian Ministry of the UCC. She's a member of the Ho-Chunk tribe in Wisconsin. Marlene serves on the Ho-Chunk Ethics Review Board. She currently serves as a board member of the American Indian Business Development Corporation, vice president of the Native American Community Development Institute, and is past president of the Minneapolis Council of Churches and served 2 terms on the Minnesota Council of Churches. The Reverend Jessica Crist served 12 years as Bishop of the Montana Synod of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, a position she started in 2007. In 2011, she was elected chair of the Conference of Bishops. Prior to 2007, she served as the director of the Northern Rockies Institute of Theology for 18 years. And Jessica and I served together on the advisory board of Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary. So we welcome Jessica and Marlene. It's good to have you with us, and the floor is yours.
Well, for some of you, it's still good morning, right?
It is still morning here in Seattle area, in Everett, Washington, yes.
I'm really excited to be a part of your venture as you go and find out more about Indian country, the indigenous people of this land. So oftentimes, historically, we've been kind of moved around and about. I always like to say that most people are living on stolen land. And a lot of people, when you say that, don't understand what that means. But we're getting braver as Indian people to point that out. We've had a busy week in Indian country. Our Secretary Holland from the Department of Interior started the initiative to put a Truth and Healing Commission together, which went before the House committee this week, and it was you were weeping if you were watching it to hear the personal stories of Indian people as they've suffered through attending boarding schools, or if they are a survivor of somebody, their parents or grandparents that went to boarding school. So we're really moving forward. Unfortunately, the churches are taking a big swipe because they're saying it was the churches that started this atrocity of boarding schools. It's not entirely true, although it's mostly true. So we have to atone for that somehow as the years come before us with this commission, if we get it. So I'd like to say that Lutherans have always been involved with Indian country, starting probably in some of the versions where we hosted mission schools and mission initiatives on some of our reservations. Rocky Boy might be the closest one to you in Montana, where maybe Bishop Jessica can enlighten us about that ministry. But so being in Indian country is not necessarily new for us as Lutherans. We've developed some good relationships although probably the whole church doesn't know that we've had those relationships going on. In the 70s, when Indian people started to speak up, it was interesting that the Lutheran Church was, through some of their people in South Dakota, were trying to maintain some relationships with the local Indian communities and the tribal reservations there. And there was a lot of push and pull. And because of all of that, I think, several major things came out of that. The Indians took over Augustana College in, I can't think of the name of this, Sioux Falls, and took over one of the dorms. And that kind of got the attention of a lot of people within our Lutheran Church. And I believe that the American Indian movement got its first few pushes to organize themselves because of the Lutherans that were there advocating with the tribal people from South Dakota. And also out of that, an organization called National Indian Lutheran Board was formed. And that was really a very interesting process. We had 3 national Lutheran church bodies at the time, and they were kind of held together under an organization called LaCusa, Lutheran Church in the USA. And so one of the outcomes of the Sioux Falls, I'm going to call it uprising, was that National Indian Lutheran Board was formed. And that was to develop on a national scale relationships with American Indian people. Now, it didn't necessarily focus on the few ministries that we had in the Lutheran Church and Indian people with congregations on some of our reservations, but it had a broader scope to it. And in Indian country, we'd like to say that probably some of the most important legislation came out in the 70s and 80s for Indian country. And I'd like to say that the Lutheran Church walked hand in hand and walked with Indian people to get some of these landmark legislation acts passed in Congress. And one of them dealt with the health care delivered by the government to Indian country. And one of it was to let us practice our own religion, the Indian Religious Freedom Act. Some had major contributions from the government as it related back to housing on Indian land. And then it's always been about education too. So there were 3 or 4 big, huge lumps of important legislation where the government realized they had a responsibility for taking all the land and to try to help make it better. For some of you who have been in Indian country, you probably can realize that it shouldn't have had to happen this way. But some of our reservations are some of the poorest, are in, they're the poorest counties, the poorest reservations here in the United States. And it shouldn't be that way. It never should have been that way. I did have to laugh in one time though, when a lot of land was being taken. They gave us the poorest land, probably almost desert-like, and now the Southwest is drying up. I don't know if you've seen pictures of Lake Powell and Lake Mead, and it supplies so much the water for all of the Southwest part of the United States. And some of that is in around Indian country. So in some of those places where they thought they were giving us just some vacant land that wasn't worth much, it's where a lot of our water, a lot of our minerals and other energy products are also coming from. So the National Indian Lutheran Board involved all kinds of people. It wasn't just Lutherans. but we had people on there that were, there were people that were able to get things done. And if we didn't have that partnership with those Lutherans bringing all these people together, it could have been a much different story. So in many ways, we're thankful for the beginning of the National Indian Lutheran Board, because it set kind of a standard about what we can do as the church, as we walk with our Indian brothers and sisters. So after we did the merger of those 3 Lutheran church bodies, things changed. And Jessica, could you tell us about that, please?
Yes, I could. And first, I just want to answer your question about Rocky Boy. Our Saviors Rocky Boy was a ministry of the ELCA. Growing up in Camp Hill, Pennsylvania, the only thing I knew about Montana was that we had a church at Rocky Boy, and my congregation supported it. So it's celebrating around their 100th anniversary, right around now. And it's been an ongoing ministry. The president of the congregation there, Lonnie Whitford, is on the ELCA Church Council, and she was also elected to the Tribal Council. So there's some exciting stuff going on there. Post National Indian Lutheran Board into the merger. 2 things I wanted to. That's one of the amazing things about it to me, was that it was like only 1/4 Lutherans, and the rest was leaders, Indian leaders from various places. And that says to me,
Marlene?
Yes.
Jessica is trying to log back on. I know that you have an outline you're following this morning, but while we're waiting for Jessica, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your work with the National Congress.
The National Congress of American Indians is one of the oldest Indian organizations in the United States. I don't know if some of you are able to do this. If you go to their website, ncai.org, you will get the most incredible 54-page information on tribal nations in the United States. And
thank you, Marlene.
yeah, so Jessica, go back.
So, and the NILB disappeared just like that. But it did not return. We had high hopes for the merger. And one of the hopes was that the work of the NILB would be incorporated into the new structure of the new church, and that we'd be able to do more rather than less. Despite the reality that the new church in the Constitution committed to becoming 10% people of color in the first 10 years, and despite the constitutional commitment to inclusiveness in all committees and boards, etc., and despite the establishment of the Commission for Multicultural Ministries and the ethnic desks, this did not happen. There were ethnic desks established for African American, Asia Pacific, Latino, and Native American. The effect of this was that American Indians and Alaska Natives were designated as an ethnic group, as a minority group, rather than as a sovereign nation. And in our structure, it remained that way until 2021. When the person who had responsibility both for our Native American ministries, but also for tribal relations, was placed structurally in with global mission and not with ethnic groups. And that is really significant. We're continuing to work on that. Treating the American Indian Alaska Natives as an ethnic group meant that we continued as a church to be tone deaf to the historical and political realities of Indigenous people. And the effect was less attention rather than more. The losses that we suffered in the merger First of all, the dissolution of the NILB meant that there was a loss of relationship with tribal leaders. The focus became on Native congregations, which are really important, but we lost that wider focus in the American Indian and Alaska Native community. We no longer had across the church those Sundays for Indian Concerns Sunday for fundraising and for education. There was less visibility, less credibility, and therefore invisibility. Now, during this time, all the time of the ELCA, there were good people called into leadership from different tribal nations. Some, many served for a short time, some served for long times. You may recognize the names of Gordon Straw or Marilyn Sorensen. But basically, every person in that position and the entire program suffered from lack of funding and lack of support and lack of attention. We had grand plans, but only one human staff person to carry out those plans. I just want to show you a couple of those plans. They may look familiar to some of you who've been church nerds for a long time. The first one, in 1997, the Churchwide Assembly adopted the American Indian Alaska Native Strategic Plan, and it was a wonderful plan. It was 5 years in the making, and it had all kinds of great suggestions of important things to do. The problem was there was never funding or staffing, and everything went back onto the one single staff person. And so that really was an exercise in futility. Next, in 2003, we got a little smarter and went ecumenical and produced a vision for partnership and unity, a resource for Friends of Christian Indian Ministry. It was a joint effort of the ELCA, the UCC, and the Presbyterians. And this is a 60-some page book that has a lovely history. It has some good history in it, some important talking points, and it's out of print, but you can get photocopies of it, and I really commend it to you as you attempt to do work. I just want to read something from the introduction. As partners for justice and wholeness, we ask that you go beyond deeper understanding to informed action, action that must always be with and not for Indian people. History has revealed many friends, often in the churches, who have harmed our people despite the best of intentions. It's a common human principle that those affected by decisions should share in those decisions. More than any other people, however, Indians have had policies made for them, not with them. Such decisions and policies have almost always been unwise. So that was 2003. In 2005, Marlene and some others were involved in something called the Indigenous Institute that was a leadership training for bishops and assistants to bishops and outreach staff people to try to immerse them over the period of 2 years in Indian country in a variety of ways and to educate them. And that was an important piece of educational work. We've had resolutions in 2011 and 2013, but from pre-merger to the 2016 Doctrine of Discovery Repudiation, the church really spent a lot of time focusing on itself and on strengthening Indian congregations and leadership for those congregations, and less time intentionally and not at all in a kind of organized way, focusing on the entire Indigenous population and issues beyond simply our churches. Not to say that there wasn't work done, fine work done by our advocacy people in the state offices, as you have, and in Washington, D.C., but the church's focus was much more on this congregational development, and that began to change. And Marlene will take up the repudiation.
Thank you. We have a very special guest for you today. Vance Blackfox is here, and Vance, maybe you could address this group and tell us your title in the ELCA.
Sure. Well, Siona God, hello everybody. Galanchi Dawado. My name is Galanchi. My English name is Vance Blackbox. It's good to see you, Beth. I just now noticed that was you. I am the Director of Indigenous Ministries and Tribal Relations in the ELCA in the Service and Justice Home area. And most of my job, my new job description is really to focus on building our relationships with tribal nations. The majority of my work is to do that. And then the rest of my responsibility is to continue to care for and journey with our communities, our Native congregations and ministries out in the church, as well as working on advocacy issues. And so really happy to learn and to hear that you folks are doing some of this really important work of learning and prayerfully and getting ready to really commit yourself to doing some advocacy work and journeying with us in this new way of doing life together with Indigenous peoples inside this church. So thank you so much for your commitment to this meeting and learning. Thank you.
Well, thank you for being with us.
I think he's going to get taken out for brunch right now.
I've got pancakes waiting on me, so I got to go. But thank you all so much.
Thanks for the greeting.
Okay, thank you. We were just lucky enough to have Vance in town this week for another ELCA gathering of PLTS people that are developing a curriculum for their team members, Indian studying for the ministry. So when he comes to town, I always make him do church.
Good for you, Marlene.
The repudiation of the doctrine of discovery has probably always been around us, but I don't know what it is about the human community. We get reluctant to kind of address things head on. But probably in the last decade and a half, many of our churches, our national denominations, started to get educated more about what's happened here historically in this country. And so they started passing the repudiation of the doctrine of discovery. I'd have to say that the Lutherans were the last large denomination to pass it. And thank God they did. And Vance was the one that wrote the resolution for us to look at that at, what is it? What do we call our national board meeting?
Churchwide Assembly.
Churchwide Assembly.
Yeah.
I belong to two different denominations, so I was getting mixed up, I have to think. But I'd say the Episcopals took a big role in getting this forward. And I think it has a lot to do with personnel and where people's passion are at any one moment. And this repudiation of doctrine of discovery was probably headed up by Sarah Eaglehart, who was a member of the Pine Ridge Reservation. And she also got an Academy Award for a short film she did based on an Indian story. But if you haven't gone to the website, you go to the Episcopalian, to their national website. You're going to have to scroll along a little bit, or maybe just type in repudiation of the doctrine of discovery, and you'll find all kinds of wonderful information. It's not a secret that the Episcopalians have more money than the Lutherans. So
bigger staff, you know.
Right. So they were able to put a lot of money into putting out educational resources. There's a beautiful film that I show often, even though it refers to the Episcopalians. I just say it refers to all of us because it's just talking about the story. And there are some other incredible documents as the UN has looked at the doctrine of discovery, and several other important pieces to read, to look at. It's a good Saturday afternoon read in the sun, when the sun comes out in Washington, right? So I would, encourage you to do that. And And we kind of struggled along and hobbled along for a while. Pretty soon the Methodists passed a repudiation, and the Presbyterians did. And the ones that probably move us forward at a bigger level than most of the denominations is the Friends. And they have a fantastic public advocacy office in Washington, D.C. And, and basically are considered by the other denominations in the public advocacy offices of the denominations in DC, that the Friends are kind of one of the leaders. They keep track of all the things that are coming before Congress as it relates to American Indians. And so they have some pieces also that we have used as educational pieces called like the blanket exercise. And Vance does that very well. He goes around and does the blanket exercise. Takes about 2 to 3 hours, depending on how many people are involved. But it's very moving. It's a actual kind of where people get into the, like they're the actors and respondents to listening to the historical movements of Indian country since contact, is what we say. And I would encourage you to think about doing that. Has anybody done the blanket exercise yet?
No.
I'd encourage you to do that. Kids can participate in it, teenagers, there can be a lot of speaking parts, there can be a lot of action parts in it. And it's real simple. You just need blankets and people. So, so I'd say that the repudiation of the Doctrine of Discovery has woke up the Lutherans. I don't know what better way to describe it, but we kind of got back on the table again when the repudiation Doctrine of Discovery was passed at Churchwide Assembly. And Vance was one of the authors of it, that young man that you just met. And so I think we're on a great movement right now, and I'm glad that congregations like yourself are willing to learn more, because when you learn more, you will most likely lead towards some action. So Jessica, why don't you tell us about the declaration then?
Sure. I wanted to say you are in Region 1, and the women of the ELCA of Region 1 are meeting at Flathead Lutheran Bible Camp in Montana. I believe it's the weekend of like the 17th, 18th, 19th of June. And the speaker is Prairie Rose Seminole, who held a churchwide position prior to Vance, and does the blanket exercise. So if any of you were thinking of maybe going to that, that would be an opportunity to learn some more things in general, and probably to do the blanket exercise. So check with your women of the ELCA leaders in your synods or your congregations if you want to get some more information. We did repudiate the Doctrine of Discovery in 2016, and it was like 97% of the people at the Churchwide Assembly voted to repudiate the Doctrine of Discovery, and there was great celebration. And then we did nothing, at least as a church. As the national church, the church-wide expression for far too long. And individual congregations and synods and seminaries and ministries were doing some work, but the resolution that we passed repudiating the Doctrine of Discovery promised to do some real specific things, and those real specific things didn't get touched. So finally, the group that Marlene and I are chairing pulled together and began to do some work on saying, okay, how can we really take seriously as a church this repudiation and the various things that we promised and beyond? What can we do to hold our feet to the fire so that we really take this seriously? And so we gathered a disparate group of people, a lot of Native and some non-Native, and meet from time to time on Zoom. And out of that group came some commitments to various tasks, including the tasks that were articulated in the Churchwide Assembly resolution repudiating the doctrine of discovery. First and foremost, we realized that not only did most people in the ELCA have no idea that we had repudiated the doctrine of discovery, they, like most Americans, had no idea what the doctrine of discovery was. So, it's all very sort of up here. And so we started some tasks to try to bring it to into people's lives, such as you're doing here. We had a subgroup who's working on a public event as promised in the resolution, and that will be taking place at the 2022 Churchwide Assembly in Columbus, Ohio, the 12th of August. We have other groups putting together and also stealing from other denominations, educational materials that will be distributed so that people get an understanding of what does this really mean. We have a group who is working with native responses to the Luther's Small Catechism. A couple of years ago, there was African-American responses to Luther's Small Catechism. We decided it would be an appropriate thing for some Indigenous responses to Luther's Small Catechism. So we have a group working on that. And then looking at our history as a church and realizing that we had once upon a time made a declaration to the Jewish people, repudiating some of the awful things that Martin Luther had said and results over the centuries, tragic results. And we'd also made a declaration to people of African descent. What if, we said, if we made a declaration to American Indian and Alaska Native people? And so we did. And over the summer of 2021, a small group appointed by Bishop Eaton wrote the declaration, and it was adopted by the ELCA Church Council in September of 2021 and released publicly to in the time for Indigenous People Day. What the declaration did was to look at and address three separate groups. The first group we addressed was American Indian, Alaska Native members of ELCA congregations. The second group we addressed was American Indian, Alaska Natives who weren't members of ELCA congregations, the general public of Indigenous people on this continent. And then third, we addressed ELCA members who are not American Indian or Alaska Native. And we did that in two sections. The first section was confessions. These are some things that we've really messed up. And the second part then was promises. This is what we intend to do as in response to the confessions that we have made. We said we would do 21 things. And that's a lot of things, given that we so easily as a church pass resolutions and pat ourselves on the back and then ignore them from, forever and ever, amen. But we have been pursuing those 21 things. And Marlene and I are going to talk about those. So I'm going to stop now and let Marlene talk about some of the things, and then I'll talk about some of the other things that we promised we would do.
Well, I always challenge people when I do my presentations, how many American Indian tribes are there in the United States? Does anybody know?
Any guess?
Close to 500.
You can guess, sure.
Close to 500.
Close to 500. What other do you have?
43.
Any other guesses?
How many tribes are recognized by the federal government in the United States? That'd be another way to look at it.
About 480.
What's the definition of a tribe?
Oh, and we want to
As
know.
opposed to, say, the whole Navajo Nation, but then there's sub deals in there.
There's a question, what is the definition of a tribe versus a nation? Or are they the same thing?
They're the same thing. I prefer to use nation. I'll tell you what, there's 575 nations within the boundaries of what we know as the United States, okay? 574 of them are tribal nations. So that's where we have to do the first correction of who we are and who we think we are and what we think we know about our country. Is we have 574 federally recognized tribes, which means there are many more, but they, either because of things like the Doctrine of Discovery, and why we're repudiating the Doctrine of Discovery is because some of our Indians got wiped out and they were not recognized as nations. And we're in the process. Every year we add one or two more. And I just think it's really ridiculous and silly that our Indigenous people have to prove to the United States who they are when they've been here forever and ever and ever. The documents that you have to fill out and hand in equals probably 500 pages of responses for each of these tribes to do that. So I think there's a sin in that. Am I able to share a screen?
1 second.
We're going to give you permission in a minute.
Thank you.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay.
Okay, just a minute. Here we go. For some reason, my phone or my computer is really slow in here.
At least it didn't kick you off like mine did.
Yeah. I'll have to wait. I can't do it. But the kind of information that I was starting to share with you is found in this document put out by National Congress of American Indians. And I was just going to pull out a few pages right now. But, I think I'm glad you're helping the Duwamish people because they're one of the people that are looking for federal recognition. Did you know that?
Yes.
And I'm glad that I believe that it's the church's partnership that'll make that happen. If you engage all the denominations that are in the state of Washington to help you do that, I think we can do it. How many tribes are in the state of Washington?
There's 29 recognized.
We have 29 recognized.
Excellent. Somebody's done their homework. Thank you. Do you know any of the names of tribal leaders of these tribes? Nobody's taken a tribal leader out to breakfast?
No.
I would challenge you to do that. Call up the tribal chairman or chairperson from Tulalip. They're the closest to you, right?
Yes, that's right.
Have some meetings at Tulalip at the conference center. In fact, you should see if you can have one of your synod meetings over there.
It's a good idea.
They have exquisite things to offer. I've been to Tulalip for maybe about 5 times for meetings. And the food that they serve, which of course salmon is one of them, but they have ice sculptures that grace every table or the serving table. It's just gorgeous, So as you look at the tribes in the state of Washington, 29 of them, you said, what are they known for? What do you know them for?
What? Casinos.
The salmon hatchery.
Salmon hatchery.
Yep.
Amazing carvings, beautiful carvings. The artwork is incredible.
The artwork, the craftsmanship.
Giving back to
I give you permission as Lutherans to go into a casino. And if you win, 10% goes to the church. So what kind of economic engines run the tribes? in the state of Washington.
What kind of economic engine runs the tribe?
Not engine, engines.
Yes,
Casinos and fisheries.
casinos, fisheries, federal dollars.
Mhm.
Fireworks.
How many of you have visited some of the tribal museums?
I'd say a majority of people in this room.
Well, I just know that I've been to the Tulalip one, and oh my gosh, it is so beautiful.
It's wonderful.
And you know, we were fortunate enough, every time we go there, we get to go to their ceremony house and see their dances with the blankets and everything. It's really beautiful. So when we look at some of these things, our tribes have a significant relationship to the federal government, to the United States government. So what national legislation is up for votes and for bills now? And I know you mentioned a couple of them when we started.
Well, we're aware of the boarding school resolution.
Mhm. I would say if some of you can get on the House, US House page, you know, Google page, you can probably find the hearing that they held on Wednesday, I think it was. And it is just so incredible to hear. And they had to take a break for about an hour and a half because they had a vote. But after they came back from the break, another person spoke, and then they asked questions to some of our boarding school survivors. And it would have you weeping and in tears just to hear, you know, the responses that they have. So, you know, when you think about what you can do now, one of the things that I found out when we had Standing Rock, do any of you remember the whole Standing Rock movement? I will
Yes,
tell you, people came in from all over the world. And if they stayed there 1 day to 5 days to a month, they would have found what would say the most perfect community, because people wanted to be on their very best. They wanted to pray every day. They wanted to address an issue about how sacred the water is and that it must remain sacred. And not possibly get contaminated by an oil spill or not. But when they came into Standing Rock, I was shocked, horrified that the local ELCA bishop did not have a relationship with the tribal chairman. And had that happened, we might have had a better outcome, where some of our Lutheran pastors had to take a stance and go against his, you know, what he was thinking. And I guess, you know, when we get called to serve with justice issues, we stand up and we say our voice and we work for change. And I think it made it very problematic. And I learned something from that. So when I do meet other bishops, I will ask them, have you gone to your local tribal officials and introduced yourself and develop a relationship with them? And or are you offering up opportunities for your congregations to get to know who the members are of a tribe? We had a statistic a long, long time ago, and it's such a long time ago, I can't even really think of it, how the exact wording went, but it said that the majority of the Lutheran congregations in America are within 20 miles of an Indian reservation.
Hmm.
Can you imagine that?
Mhm.
And still yet, we don't know our neighbors,
Yeah.
you know, and that came out really clear when I realized that the Bishop of North Dakota that had Standing Rock in, you know, I don't want to say his territory because we had another bishop that said, oh yeah, another reservation is in my territory. And I'm going like, no, it isn't. No, it isn't. We won't get into that. That's a whole nother story. But I guess I would challenge you to find some ways now where you get out of Zoom, you get out of the building, and you get over and get out into these communities. And I just think you will find yourself being blessed, not just because you're meeting different people, but because you're being blessed to see the greatness of what God has put within us and the diversity of people that live right next door. Yes.
Thank you, Marlene. That's wonderful. Can I give some of the specific suggestions that we promised in our declaration? We made all these promises and then thought, oh my gosh, how are we going to do these all? So we divided them into things that can be done most quickly, and then we'll take a little longer, and then we'll take a little longer. And you can jump into any of these. The first one was to celebrate holidays and anniversaries, or to commemorate. Find out when there was a massacre in your area, or find out when something important went on for the Indigenous people, and make note of it. Don't simply ignore it. Then we had honor Native leadership and learn from it and secure a place at decision-making tables. Encouraged land acknowledgements across the church. Yesterday, the Oregon Synod passed a resolution to go on to the churchwide assembly about land acknowledgements and land return. National, state, and global advocacy. You're doing that right now, and congratulations. And then we committed to partnership with Native nations and Native organizations that educate and support and interpret rights. One of them is the National Boarding School Coalition that Marlene has referred to. Another one is the National Congress of American Indians. And we are encouraging people to sign up, to get involved. It's a wonderful way to learn. Develop a strategy to grow the fund. Then one of the longer term goals is to work towards the elimination of racism. And what I would add to that is that for so many years, almost all the resources on racism, whether it was secular resources or church resources, were very, very fine, but they were focused on Black, white, and occasionally would throw in Latino. There are resources now out there that have to do with racism towards Native Americans, towards Indigenous people, and they are different issues. And so be sensitive to that. Find some, ask me, I've got some, and I know Marlene does as well. Let's see, communicating concerns across the church, supporting leadership education that's Native focused and Native led. That's what Vance Blackfox was doing in the Twin Cities this week, working on a curriculum for the teen program at PLTS for Indigenous folks, and then exploring the church's role in family separation and boarding schools. Supporting tribal nations and missing and murdered Indigenous women and their families. There are across the country, there are organizations that are dedicated to lifting up missing and murdered Indigenous people. There are things that we can do. If our congregations are within 20 miles of reservations, we can do something, but we have to be educated about that. And whether it's simply saying, we're praying for you as you search for this lost daughter, or bringing a casserole, or going out and literally beating the bushes to join a search party. There are things that we can do, and Lutherans are good at doing things. Continuing to work on the Doctrine of Discovery, and then the longer term ones, working for inclusion of Indigenous history in schools, supporting tribal nations in language preservation, and supporting buyback of tribal lands. That's a really fast going over the 21 things that the Church Council promised in the Declaration, and you'll be hearing more about. And if you want to do any work in any of those areas, Marlene and I would love to hear about what you're doing. So thank you. And do you have some questions? And Marlene, do you want to add some more? Like, it looks like we've got about 10 minutes left. And
yeah, one thing I was just going to say, Deb Juarez, have any of you heard of her? She happens to be an American Indian serving on the Seattle City Council. And I think it would be good if you want to have some visitors come and talk with you during this time, put Deb Juarez on your list and see if she can come out and share some of the things. The other person that is really good is Colleen Echohawk. Colleen ran for mayor of Seattle in the last election, and she didn't make it. I think she came in second. And she is the queen mother of housing. She seems to be very inspirational and transformative. There are a lot of words that you could put to her as she's attacked the whole issue of homelessness in Seattle. And she ran a big program for that, which has won national awards. But now she is the CEO of the Eighth Generation. She's an excellent speaker and knows so much about, your region, in particular, if you consider yourself a suburb of Seattle, you can get some really great information from her too. So those are the two names I'd recommend to you.
Thank you, Marlene.
Denise Juneau was the superintendent of schools in Seattle for a while, and she is an Indigenous person from Montana. She was served as, she was in charge of education in Montana before going to Seattle.
Okay. So are there questions or comments from, and we encourage people that are logging in to go on the chat and make your comments there and questions, and then here in the room, questions or comments you'd like to address to Marlene or to Jessica.
I have a question. I was reading this the repudiation doctrine, and as before on other things, I get hung up on the word reconciliation, which is a powerful term, but it's meaningless if it doesn't have any power. And I was thinking about the sovereignty of the tribes nationally, and I'm wondering if there's ever been any thought given to trying to have a constitutional amendment, whereas the tribes can collectively be represented in our Congress. I know our territorial representation doesn't have a voting right. I have an issue with that as well, but have you lobbied or tried to be more part of the decision-making process and get a constitutional commitment to be considered when we make laws?
There is a movement right now, and there's been a lot of conversation for many, many years, but somewhere there was written in a legal document giving the right for one of the tribes in Oklahoma to be seated in a Congress. And I don't think it's the Cherokee Nation, it's one of the other big ones. It's not coming to mind right now. But there's been more movement on that in the last 12 months than there has been in the last 12 years. That's one answer that I have. We are paying, Indian tribes are paying $1 billion to white, what do you call them? They're the people that go to Washington to ask for things.
Lobbyists?
Lobbyists, yeah, that's quite a business. And, especially because we have so many tribes now that are into gaming where they can afford those kinds of things. And that seems to be the only way we know. One of the movements that I started and a friend of mine is that we need more Indian lobbyists going to Washington, D.C. to state our own issues and not have white people advocating for us, because it's an economic venture, and I think the big event that we celebrated was when 2 Indian women got elected to be U.S. House representatives in the last election. And I'm hoping that we can have some more people that will become legislators. We do have, I think there's 5 in the U.S. House of Representatives right now. Doesn't completely answer your question, but those are the ways that we have found that would be the most important, is to be represented and sitting in the halls of Congress. I just had one of our members was with Secretary Holland this week when they had the hearings. And she said she could not believe how many white men were walking the halls, as our leaders and stuff. She said, yeah, there's a lot of women that have been elected now, but it's still that presence of white men that are still running this country and making decisions. Anybody else?
Other questions or comments? Go ahead, Paul.
I just want to say thank you. I don't necessarily have a question, but I just want to say, having known both of you for many years, just thank you for your leadership in each of your settings, if you know what I mean, in each of your backgrounds, in terms of who each of you are, and thank you for still doing it. And each of you have put on many, many miles, and I know that your commitment is deep and your passion is deep for this issue, and that you will continue to travel miles. And thank you for taking time to be with us today.
Well, thanks for the work you do too, Paul, and for the work that all of you are doing. I mean, and I know Marlene talked a little bit earlier about the National Congress of American Indians, but if you go to ncai.org?
Yeah.
.org. You can find all kinds of information there, including legislative priorities. I mean, there's a legislative priority to support language retention. And, the question about is anyone working on a legislative priority to have representation in Congress from tribal nations? Their list of legislative priorities is really instructive, and you can just, it's wonderful to learn everything if you just go to their website.
We also invite you to become a member of the NCI. You can become a member either as a congregation or as individuals.
Okay. Well, I want to add my thanks to Paul's on behalf of Our Saviors Lutheran Church here in Everett, Washington. We want to thank you both for your contribution today, and for your continued work and advocacy for our Native brothers and sisters. And we're going to sign off at this point, ending the official recording, and let you go. And then we have just a little bit of business for the class. And again, thank you so much. Blessings on your ministries. And thank you again for being with us today.
All right, thanks. Take care.
Thank you.